Despite all the problems LA has, it's always been a place where people pursue the good life. Well, what makes LA challenging to governing is that LA was set up to not be like New York City and Chicago. I've always been struck by how the culture and the economy are sort of bigger than politics and government in many ways. And then government sort of breaks in at key moments. Nobody knows who's in charge of it because it has this archaic system, which is now, as you and I will discuss, about to be transformed.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the California Future Society podcast. This week, I have a great one for you. I have Dr. Raphe Sonenshein, who was actually a professor of mine when I wanted to take a class learning about how LA is governed and managed, and he is the perfect guest for thinking about LA governance. He has spent his entire career thinking about how LA is managed. He worked in City Hall under Mayor Tom Bradley. He's been a professor for 30 years. He's written books about LA government. He was involved in past charter reform efforts. So in our conversation, we talk about why LA is so challenging to govern in the first place and how so many of those factors are by design. We talk about how LA's political culture differs from other cities. We talk about ongoing charter reform at the city and the county level, to ongoing processes that will have major implications for how our region is governed going forward. We talk about the fate of the working class going forward in Los Angeles and how challenging it is given the affordability crisis. We talk about why he's cautiously optimistic about homelessness in the near future and what gives him hope for the future of California. So I had a lot of fun speaking with him. He brings a lot of joy and positive energy in the way that he speaks. He's a storyteller with a wealth of experience. So I had a lot of fun speaking with Raphe. I'm sure you'll have a lot of fun listening to him as well. As always, make sure to subscribe wherever you're hearing this or at californiafuturesociety.com. With that, here's Raphe. I'm so excited to have you on. This is a conversation that I've been hoping for ever since I started this podcast. You're someone I think very highly of. I took a class from you on LA politics and governance, so a lot of what I learned is from you. So excited to talk to you today. And could you introduce yourself and your connection to California as a way to start the conversation?
Well, before I forget, you were a very good student. So
thank you. Yeah, well, you have to say it because we're on camera. Yeah,
I know, but it's good to be connected with you again. So I'm Raphe Sonenshein. I'm the relatively new executive director of the John Randolph Haynes and Dora Haynes Foundation, which funds research on governance and democracy in the greater LA region, almost coming up on our 100th anniversary next year. And before that, when you were my student, I was still executive director of the Pat Brown Institute for Public Affairs at Cal State LA. And before that, 3 decades teaching political science at Cal State Fullerton. So that's me.
Well, I know you have a heart for teaching, but for you, it doesn't just stay in the classroom or in academic text. You've also been someone who's been very hands-on, not only working in LA City Hall, but then also on pressing issues like charter reform. Could you give a quick overview of some of your different roles, the hats that you've worn outside of academia as well over the years?
Sure. I've always had one foot in, one foot out. During my graduate school years, I moved to LA from New Haven, Connecticut, where I was in a doctoral program at Yale, interested in Los Angeles, and ended up working for Mayor Tom Bradley and for a city councilman whose chief deputy was somebody named Maxine Waters, who you all know is a member of the House, was my boss back then. Eventually, I went into teaching. And in the late 90s, I got invited to apply to be executive director, a position I'd never held, for the new appointed Charter Reform Commission that was eventually to complete the first complete transformation of the LA City Charter in 75 years. And that is when I became a charter geek. And in addition to my previous work on race and ethnicity and coalition politics, which is still very close to my heart, but since then, I've really written about and talked about LA government, its problems, its illnesses, and its solutions. And it keeps me very occupied. And here I am at a foundation for whom that's the principal interest. So what could be bad, as my mother would have said.
Exactly. Well, and let's start on what makes LA unique when it comes to governance. I know a lot of people talk about it being really challenging to govern. And a lot of people just assume that all cities are the same. What is unique about LA and what makes it challenging to govern?
Well, what makes LA challenging to governing is that LA was set up to not be like New York City and Chicago. That's the exact purpose of 20th century governance in Los Angeles, led by the progressive movement with a capital P, which you learned about in the class that you took with me.
Yes.
Because the feeling was that New York City and Chicago were corrupt party machines with party bosses, which was certainly true. although there were many virtues in New York and Chicago that weren't valued when LA government was created. But they almost created it as an anti-Chicago, anti-New York system. They dispersed power instead of keeping power concentrated. So in New York, the mayor is everything. There's sort of a city council. Chicago has sort of a city council, but everybody knows the voice that really matters is the voice of the mayor. But when you came out to LA, where I came out in the 1970s, I actually loved it, as difficult as it was, because there were so many openings for a new person to get involved.
Hmm.
And I used to tell students like yourself, this is a place where anybody can find their way into City Hall. I walked into City Hall in 1974, a month after I arrived. And at the end of that month, I was working for Tom Bradley. That could never have happened in New York and Chicago, where they would basically say, who do you know? Or as somebody famously said in Chicago, don't send me nobody, nobody sent. That's just not the story here. I was a stranger and got hired. But the dispersal meant there's an amazing number of veto points
Hmm.
of independent political forces that can push back against even the strongest mayor. And I probably worked for the strongest mayor, Tom Bradley. And Tom Bradley had to deal with a very powerful city council. It had a lot of authority, unlike the New York and Chicago case. The LA County Board of Supervisors, independently elected, controlling social services. In New York City, the mayor controls those social services. You had the Board of Education, independently elected. And the voters always tell the mayor, fix the schools. And the mayor says, absolutely, I'm going to do that. No question. Then they get in and find out they can't because it's independent. You have all sorts of sub-governments, 87 other cities in LA County, along with the city of LA. You have unincorporated territory. To me, it always reminded me of a menagerie. Some people would call it worse than a menagerie. But what I loved about it was that there were so many different people who could bring their voices to the table. What I didn't love about it is there are some issues where it's really hard to get anything done without collaboration among these areas of governance. So we're only as good as our diplomatic ability. No one person can tell everybody what to do.
I love those examples that you gave. And, for anyone who gripes about the fragmented nature of LA governance, it's also easy to look to those East Coast cities and recognize that centralization doesn't solve all your problems, right? Those endless veto points are frustrating, but you still have political divisions and disagreements, regardless of the structure and the devolution of power. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and let's put it this way. Being mayor of any of the three largest cities of the country, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, you're probably best off thinking of it as your career ender rather than your career beginning, because it should top off your career. Like this will be Karen Bass's last job. She knows that. She's had many wonderful positions in government before around the country, in the House and in Sacramento. But the best way to be a mayor of these three cities is to say, I'm going to knock it out of the park now, not as a stepping stone to something else, because everyone's going to be mad at me by the time I leave. But it's phenomenally exciting
Hmm.
because you're dealing with some of the most ingrained problems the system can possibly have. Examples being homelessness, crime, housing, um, and everybody's in your face because they see you. They see you when you're walking around. That's what local government is all about, which is what I love about local government. But true, in New York, you can get great things done. You can also make absolutely catastrophic mistakes if there's nobody to hold you back, nobody to
Hmm.
tell you no. So it's a wild ride no matter what you do. Now, by the way, it's a much wilder ride in Chicago and New York. And the reason is those are much more political cities than Los Angeles.
Let's let's talk about that, the political culture of LA, because there's the structural pieces to it, but there's also just a cultural, somewhat lack of engagement. As one example, the public affairs firm I used to work at, we had a New York headquarters where the firm was based, and then I was at the LA satellite office. And we would often talk about how just when it came to, for something example of something like press, in New York you had dozens of papers you could pitch and different focus on different boroughs or ethnic groups or different subtopics, versus in LA it was like after the LA Times, there's a pretty big fall off. There's other great reporters out there, but the culture of consuming news and studying local government and knowing who your local players were, there's a huge, massive gap. Can you speak to that in LA?
Oh, heck yeah. I mean, I grew up in New Jersey and lived in Manhattan after college. And there were probably 3 or 4 newspapers on a daily basis. You can get a morning paper, you get an afternoon paper, different ideologies, and they all wanted to know what the mayor was doing. So if the mayor went to the Yankee game, all the cameras were there because the mayor was at the Yankee game. If they went to the Mets game, then you had a big battle whether it should be the Mets or the Yankees. The mayor was the most important cultural figure in the city. Now, you've been around LA to know about Jarrett, that there's a lot of cultural figures that are bigger than the mayor of Los Angeles. You know, you're at
Yes.
the center of American culture right
Yeah.
here.
Kim Kardashian draws a lot more names than Karen Bass or any other mayor. Yeah.
Well, back in 1961, a scholar named Charles Mayo studied Los Angeles government, and he said something that I think is really quite wonderful. He said it's a disconnected political system. There's much more concern if Koufax has a bad night at Dodger Stadium than if something goes wrong at City Hall. It's as true now as it was then, except around crises like the wildfire or policing issues where suddenly it explodes. On a day-to-day basis, the mayor can travel around town. When I wrote my first book on Tom Bradley, it took me forever to get an interview with him, and I finally just said, can I just ride with you for a day? And they stuck me in the back of a little sedan with 3 staff members, and Tom Bradley sitting in front reading the newspaper and not even talking to me, and me passing my tape recorder back and forth, and occasionally I could get a good answer out of him. And I thought to myself, if this was the mayor of New York, I'd be in 3 cars with reporters everywhere taking pictures, and Tom Bradley could go and spend a whole day. It was his day in what was then called South Central LA. So it's a much more down-to-earth political culture. It sometimes has a little bit of a small town politics quality.
Hmm.
People do have a sense to know who these elected officials are, but at the same time, part of it is governance. The County Board of Supervisors, nobody knows who's in charge of it because it has this archaic system, which is now, as you and I will discuss, about to be transformed, called by Measure G, passed in November. If something goes wrong, who do you blame? You've got 5 supervisors, nobody's in charge. So if you ask the voters, they might have a complaint about the foster care system, but they don't have a politician to focus on about it. They just focus on the problems with the people in foster care.
Yeah.
So the structure does reduce political visibility because we tend to be a society politically that focuses on executives, the president, the governor, the mayor. And there's a lot of other players in the system, and sometimes people just throw up their hands. But a lot of it is that in many ways, despite all the problems LA has, it's always been a place where people pursue the good life. I live in Santa Monica, not far from Rand, again, where you were my student. What were we, about 4 blocks from the ocean?
Yeah.
In that class, I used to teach a class at Santa Monica College, and the kids would bring their surfboards. Now, by the way, it was very hard to get them to pay attention to the separation of powers on a really nice day.
Yeah.
But there's something to that, which is the weather, the culture, all these things are very engaging. Who is a bigger celebrity if you're out shopping and a person who walks in is a starting guard on the LA Lakers or your city council member? Now, the city council member is kind of important, quite important, but the other guy's a Laker, for God's sake. I mean, you don't need to be a Kardashian to be a celebrity in LA. So I guess I think that it's because there's so many other things going. Now, New York, of course, has many other things going, but a long tradition of the mayor being one of those celebrities, being sort of, because their dominance in the system is so great.
Well, let's talk about charter reform. You said you're a charter geek, and right now we're living through really important charter reforms. There's there's an initiative that's been going on several years now at the city level, and like you just said, but in light of Measure G at the county level as well. And can you just talk about how important this period is? Because in my mind, charter reform is like it's like Halley's Comet. Like maybe you see it once, maybe twice in your lifetime. To have it simultaneously happen at the city and the county level simultaneously is absurd.
It's truly unbelievable. And as an expert on charters, I feel a little bit like an expert on butterflies. And nobody can possibly want to talk to me about butterflies unless there's a butterfly invasion. or all the butterflies have disappeared. Then suddenly they say, get Sonenshein on the phone so we can talk about what happened to the butterflies. Charters usually emerge, and governance reform emerges from catastrophe. So in our case, the 1990s, when I was first a charter person, was the years of the Rodney King beating, the civil unrest, the attempt of the San Fernando Valley and the LA Harbor to break away and cut the city in half, which would have been a catastrophe. There was all this going on. And what the feeling was, the only way to save the city is to reform the government. That's what it took to get the energy for that to happen. There really has been a long vacuum for the last 30 years of that kind of reform in LA because there hasn't been something that quite qualifies. Now we got one, which oddly enough was a surreptitiously recorded set of discussions at a building in Los Angeles where 3 LA council members and a labor leader were disparaging, especially African Americans, but in their crudeness, basically went after just about everybody. There was almost not a group they didn't have time for in this discussion.
Yeah.
It blew up, and immediately focus became City Hall because of the 3 council members, and there became a huge movement to change the redistricting system because this is all about redistricting. It was about which ethnic group should have priority in redistricting. I was one of a group of academics who were called upon by local philanthropy to develop an agenda for the city council and with the city council, and a lot of it got passed by the voters, especially redistricting. So that follows the typical pattern. The surprising part is that this wave was so strong that a level of government that almost never spends 5 minutes on serious reform, which is county government, got drawn in. And a couple of members of the supervisors board decided to take a huge leap and reform the county government more dramatically than the city government. I don't think there isn't a little bit of, kind of competition between county and city. We're not going to get left behind on this reform stuff.
And for context, how long had it been since the last major county charter reform, roughly?
Never.
Oh, wow.
In 1855, the structure of the LA County government was as follows: 5 elected supervisors with executive and legislative authority. In 2024, the structure of LA County government is 5 elected supervisors with legislative and executive authority. So, during that time, LA adopted 4 or 5 charters, finally the big one in 1925, then a big reform in 99, the one that I was involved in, changing the power of the mayor. But it was always a mayor-council system. It wasn't a fundamentally changed system. There are 58 counties in Los Angeles. 57 of them have the identical system to Los Angeles.
You're saying cities, right? Not counties? Yeah.
Did I say cities? Okay.
Or you said counties. You said 58 counties within Los Angeles.
Okay, there are 58 counties in California.
Okay, yeah.
58 counties in California, 57 of them have the exact same system that LA County has had since 1855. One of them is different because San Francisco is a combined county city. I don't think that counts because that goes way, way back. That's deep in history. So by some miracle, you'd have to assume that the perfect system of government for a local government is 5 elected supervisors with executive and legislative authority. Weirdly, Jarrett, in the 1910s and 1920s, cities around the country experimented with that system with a different name. It was called the commission system because of a flood in Galveston, Texas, that was resolved all the damage because they created a commission. So everybody thought, let's create a commission.
Yeah.
It was such a bad system that almost every city except Portland, Oregon, abandoned it almost immediately. But thank God for our counties, they held on to it forever. So we have a commission system. So when people in east side of Altadena did not receive emergency warnings, and that's where most of the deaths occurred in the fire. Altadena is what's called an unincorporated territory of the county. It's not a city, even though people think it is. So it's dependent on the county. To this day, no one's been able to figure out why East Altadena did not receive that notification.
Mm.
At the same time, the city of LA has been embroiled in angry battles between and among the mayor, the fire chief, the city council, everybody, because it's assumed that somebody there is going to be accountable, usually the mayor,
Mm-hmm.
with the wildfire situation. So, long way of saying it's astonishing. Now, to give you another sidelight on my job, 49 years ago, the John Randolph Haynes and Dora Haynes Foundation, my employer, financed its own commission on county charter reform because the county was setting up yet another commission that was going to go nowhere.
Mm.
When the Haynes Foundation set up its own commission, the county closed down its commission and everybody went with the Haynes Commission. And that commission proposed an elected county executive and a 9-member board of supervisors, the exact measure 49 years later that voters approved in November. So I would put it this way: don't ever think a good deed will never be rewarded. You just have to wait 49 years for it to happen.
Yeah.
Ironically, a couple of the people who worked on that report are still around,
Wow.
in retirement. So it's pretty incredible. So
That gives me hope for some of my Rand reports. I still have 45 years or so
oh,
until to
you're
see whether
just
or not they
starting
make an
out.
impact. Yeah.
You're just starting. You're not even 49 years old, so you got
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
least another 49 years to see. It does prove, though, public policy can be like that. There were people who proposed the equivalent of Social Security decades before 1935 in
Yeah.
various forms. It takes forever. But what's so odd is that we're watching this in real time happen in November, and I'm finding this report on our shelf that we didn't even remember we had. And there it was. So, but the odds of it happening were very slim. It got turned down by the voters a bunch of times, partly because they carved it up into pieces that were incomprehensible. But the wave of reform was so strong this time
Yeah.
that it won, not by a lot. I was watching on election night. Everybody else is watching all the other returns. I'm watching the Nerd Fest, which is Measure G.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm the only person in California who's watching it. And they're down by a few points, and I'm saying, don't get your hopes up. This is
Yeah.
dead. It always dies. It always dies. Then they pick up a few points. Then they pick up a few more points. They go into the lead. And somehow in these elections, once you go into the lead, it sort of never goes back. And it kept adding and adding and adding, and it wins. Who
Wow.
knew?
Well, so if you're an average voter, right, and maybe in the cases of East Altadena, these other cases, the nature of county government impacts your life. But for most people in an average day, they don't think about county government or county services. If things go well in charter reform, what tangible impacts or changes do you think people in Los Angeles would notice, whether they're in unincorporated territory or just anyone who votes in LA County elections?
Well, it's a great question because a few things should happen in an ideal world. The elected executive, that I call an executive, not an elected mayor. People are going to start calling them a county mayor. They're not quite a mayor. They're different than a mayor because the departments of the county are just gigantic social service machines
Mm-hmm.
that elected executive is going to have to get their arms around. Now, LA City has lots of departments, but the whole job of the mayor is not managing those departments. There's a lot of other pieces of what the mayor does. The county executives really got to spend a lot of time, because if something goes wrong in foster care, now you're going to have somebody to blame.
Yeah.
The buck is going to stop somewhere. That will startle the voters, I think, because you said something about being aware of county government or county services. People are a lot more aware of county services than of county government.
Hmm.
I'm not even sure they think of the services as part of the government, because the departments, public health, foster care, mental health, they're like governments unto themselves practically.
Yeah.
People have a feeling about it, probably not a very positive one, because very often the people who utilize the county services are not in a good economic situation
Yeah.
and maybe in desperate need of those services. And the last thing they're thinking about is, how am I going to support somebody for office who's going to help help me deal with this issue I'm having. They're really dealing with much more immediate things. What I'm hoping is that this will open up the county a lot more, because
Hmm.
to be a successful elected executive, you're going to have to talk to a lot of people about a lot of things that have tended to kind of fall through the cracks in the county government. Just the way a mayor does, even though I'm not going to call them a mayor, but it's kind of what an executive does. If nothing else, I think people will have a much better understanding of what the county does, because in many ways, for better or for worse, the people who educate or miseducate us about government are the elected executives, because they talk
Hmm.
the most. And talking is a big part of educating. In fact, you really can't be a successful elected executive unless you're out there talking about
Yeah.
what's going on, talking about the system, explaining it. So I don't have the answer to all of it. I think it'll be quite interesting for people in unincorporated territory,
Yeah.
who usually are the stepchildren of the county system. In addition, having 9 supervisors instead of 5 cuts in half the size of the districts.
Yeah.
Right now, there are 2 million people in one district. Now there'll be a little more than 1 million.
Yeah.
It's still a lot of people, but it's 50% more attention for you, and your supervisor is no longer an administrator
Yeah.
with executive authority over departments. Their job is to keep you in mind all the time.
Hmm.
It's going to be more of a representative job. Somebody once said, maybe I forgot who it was, that when you go off to the county supervisors after being an elected council member in LA, you become more powerful and more forgettable because nobody knows what you're doing.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you're a city council member, you don't have nearly the power of a supervisor, but everybody knows who you are in your district, and they
Yeah.
come and they yell at you.
Yeah.
You know, if there's things they don't like, they'll throw you out of office. So those offices will be more visible and yet less powerful.
Yeah.
That's okay, because power without visibility is not very good for people's civic engagement.
Yeah. I want to pivot a little bit. You talked about people who are in need of county services, often being desperate for that. And I know during COVID at the Pat Brown Institute, you did research on the state of the working class in Southeast LA and how different
Yeah.
people were faring. And one question I have for you as someone who's thought a lot about the makeup of LA and how different people are faring across the county is, what do you think of when you think about the future of the working class in LA? Because earlier you talked about people come to LA for the good life, and we think about the glitz and glamour version of that. But for a lot of Angelinos, it's a much more nuts and bolts, just kind of like place for economic opportunity. You know, they're not
Yeah,
seeking
that's right.
Hollywood; they're seeking a good job and a place to live and good weather and a nice lifestyle. But since COVID, between price inflation and housing going up 20+% or whatever, um, it seems like it's the working class is in a really tough spot and will be for the foreseeable future. And that LA is not the bastion of opportunity that it used to be. Can you speak to that and how you think about what things are going to look like
Yeah,
going forward?
it's a great question. You know, there's a lot of different types of experiences in LA. One is the person from the Midwest who got tired of the cold weather and came out here and think they're in paradise, basically.
Yeah,
And the weather's nice. And in the days when housing costs were a lot lower, you know, in the 40s and 50s, they got a small house somewhere. There's a whole history in the African American community of this being one of the biggest home ownership communities for African Americans in the 1930s,
yeah,
when it was very rare and people migrated from the South for that good life. A lot of the working class struggles are indeed now people who came for economic opportunity, very often immigrants, and went into industries that were difficult, were with difficult jobs with low wages, but their goal in places like Southeast LA was to have a time when their children could have a better life. It wasn't so much them having the better life as their children having a better life.
mm,
We know that Cal States, including where I taught, my school, Cal State LA, my former school, was the #1 site in the country for upward mobility of their students.
wow,
And also had one of the largest immigrant populations and first generation populations in California, maybe in the country. So there's a difference between coming So one can enjoy the good life, or what appeared to be the good life, in Southern California versus, as you say, coming for economic opportunity. And when that opportunity is restricted, when tariffs hit Southern California, they're hitting the port of Long Beach and Los Angeles. A lot of those are blue collar jobs, including
Yeah.
in trucking and warehousing. It's going to have a very big impact. It's going to be very difficult for people. So I think it is important to say whose good life. And for a lot of people, it's the good life of their children.
Mhm.
And I think that's where the class differences really sort of shine and come out in Los Angeles. It's as the economy was doing well over the last few years. LA, had some real resurgence of employment and wages were going up, but still it wasn't keeping up with housing costs.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what, housing, we all know we have to build a lot more housing. Our governance system makes it really hard to do that because there's so many veto points
Yeah.
with so many governments, with 88 cities, each with their own desire for land use control. Housing is really the crisis. But now, if the economy goes into a recession, the people at the working class level will experience it the worst. It'll hit them the hardest. And, there's at least a decent chance that that's on the horizon, or at least an economy that's not very solid because it's good one day, not so good the next day,
Yeah.
depending on the whims in Washington. So it's a tough time. It's a really tough time right now.
Yeah. Well, that's helpful to think about because I think, like you were saying, whose dream? I think that is important. And there's a perception of LA that the rest of the country has, that the rest of the world has, as the global city of Hollywood and excitement on the beach. But I grew up in the Inland Empire, and there's other parts of
Yeah.
the Southern California region that's much more, um, yeah, blue collar or working class, or people who are just hoping for a home with a yard and a nice life and a quality existence. So it's helpful to think about that.
Well, it's also interesting. It's becoming kind of a dividing line in the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Uh, if you've noticed, there were some articles recently about Antonio Villaraigosa running and hoping to be running against Kamala Harris, who I think he will not defeat.
Yeah.
But his argument is that he represents the people in the second group, which is people who are struggling economically and don't really have time for a lot of the issues that animate better off Democrats, et cetera. And he's trying to pigeonhole Harris as being in that category. I don't know that it'll work, but it's kind of a debate going on in the party right now. Now, personally, I think intra-party debates are a complete waste of time and that they ought to just say there's plenty of room for both points of view, because all the public picks up is you're not doing well because you're a losing team whose locker room is filled with recrimination. But nobody's asking my advice on that except you. So, but I think, Los Angeles is such an interesting place because LA survives partly by its portrayal of itself.
Yeah.
Even the worst stuff is actually grist for the latest iteration of Harry Bosch, which is I don't know if you've seen it, a wonderful series about an LA detective, and the scenes are shot at places where I've eaten lunch, maybe ate that day. And, this whole noir thing of LA is also marketable. People sell books, they sell movies. You go overseas and you say you're from California, and they'll say things. Now they say the fires, and other times they'll say the Lakers. It's sort of all over the place.
Yeah.
But that's part of the history of LA, which is LA was not a natural site for a city. So in order to build a great city, the idea was to encourage people to move from the Midwest. So they said that land is cheap, which it was. This was in the 1870s and 1880s.
Yeah.
They could get free rail travel out there because the railroads wanted people to be out there so that more people would come visit them on the railroads. And then when they'd get there and they found a kind of a dusty town, not a lot of services, not quite New York and Chicago, but now they're committed. They're there. And then they begin to tell everybody it's heaven.
Yeah.
The land is dirt cheap, so come on out. And the theory being, if more people come out, it will become great.
Yeah.
But to get them to come out, it has to kind of be great. So there is this mixed thing of kind of feast and famine about what is LA.
Yeah.
And you just, after a while, you just live with it.
Yeah.
Catastrophe followed by fabulous, incredible things. And I don't know any other place in the country, maybe in the world, that is like that. But people think they know all about LA who have never set foot here.
Yeah.
They know everything about it. In the 90s, they knew it was all gang violence.
Yeah.
And then something changed and they thought something else about it. In the 40s, it was the movies and Hollywood.
Yeah.
Um, so I've always been struck by how the culture and the economy are sort of bigger than politics and government in many ways.
Yeah.
And then government sort of breaks in at key moments. Obviously, government still keeps the lights on. I mean, they're still operating.
Yeah.
But government's not dominant as it is where I grew up in New Jersey and New York, where knowing the mayor was kind of the key to everything. If you knew the mayor,
Yeah.
maybe you got a shot.
Yeah.
Otherwise, don't send me nobody sent.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, I have two more questions to wrap up. And one is that um, you talked about the waves of what people identify with LA. On the negative side, recently, a lot of people identify homelessness as one of the things with LA. And
Mm-hmm.
earlier, you're talking about levels of desire for change in city hall, in county government. Obviously, there was kind of the scandals with the tape recording and other things like that. But I think of frustration with homelessness, particularly after voters approved big measures to fund, housing of different types, affordable housing, and not seeing a massive increase. That seems to be like one of the major issues that people are most frustrated with when it comes to LA governance. Do you see that issue meaningfully changing in the next 5, 10 years, or what will it
I
take to
do.
see major
I
progress?
do. For one thing, astonishingly, voters again approved a very large ballot measure, Measure A, to
Mm-hmm.
provide substantial funding for addressing homelessness. It's a very big deal. So on the one hand, voters are very distraught about homelessness. Oddly enough, there's been some progress made. And
Hmm.
sometimes making some progress is even more frustrating because then you think, how come we can't do the whole thing?
Yeah.
There's been some recent developments where the city and county have collaborated a bit, and there's more of a focus on metrics, on really measuring things correctly. Because if you don't do that, imagine if you were doing the COVID crisis as public health and you don't know how many people have tested positive. You
Yeah.
have to know the state of things. And I think they've finally made some progress on that. Now they're under a lot of external pressure. The governor, who's obviously thinking of running for president, is, talking about eliminating all encampments, homelessness
Yeah.
encampments. That's a very popular position. Not that easy to carry out. The city has been reducing the encampments by quite a bit, and that helps. It helps in areas like Venice and a few other areas.
Yeah.
They're going to have to move faster. And I think that the wildfire, of course, took everybody off the progress that was being made on homelessness.
Yeah.
I actually think the next year could be a promising one on this because of the new funding, the better data structure they're using. They've got some good governance structures in place between the city and county. Um, I'm modestly hopeful. That's
Hey,
as
I'll take
far as
it.
I'm willing to go.
I'm sure other voters will take that as well. I'll take modestly hopeful after
Yeah, that's
uh,
something.
it's something. It could be worse. Okay. Well, I realize we're at time, and the conversation I always like to end, rather the question I like to end conversations on is what gives you hope for the future of California?
Well, it's just impossible not to, because California has always had crisis, tragedy, hope, and success, and all kinds of things. And I figure we're due. I think it's time for another round of some good things happening. Somehow the Olympics have a way of focusing the mind, and sort of around something that actually people kind of agree on, that sports is one of the few things where your effort is really rewarded and measured,
Yeah.
and whoever does the best wins. It's a great way to show off the LA region because, unlike everywhere else, you could have things in 20 different venues, as happened in 1984,
Yeah.
and get kind of a tour of the region. So I think the next few years, if we can get through the next few years, I mean, there's a lot going on in the country that I don't have to tell you. It is very, very perilous. LA is due for some good times. It's time.
I love it. It's like baseball, right? You're due, right? If the player's
You
not,
do.
when
You
Shohei hasn't
do.
hit a homer in a few at bats, then why not? Yeah.
Well, when I used to go to Yankee games with my dad and my brothers, Yogi Berra would get up, great Yankee catcher, and hadn't been doing very well. And my dad would lean over and said, "Yogi's due," and he'd almost always get a hit. So we're due.
LA's due. Well, Rafe, thank you so much for your time. I think so highly of you. I think back to your class often. I was had fun pulling out your old book.
Hey, there it
Yeah,
is.
you mentioned it earlier, and you're talking about getting the recordings with Mayor Bradley. So I appreciate you taking time to speak with me today and enlightening me and the listeners on LA governance. So,
And congratulations on your podcast. I'm really thrilled for you, and I think it's going to be. I'll become a watcher and listener to your program.
wonderful. Thank you so much, Rafe.
Okay, Jared. Bye bye.